Imagine rolling across the Norman countryside in 50 tons of steel and certainty, believing yourself invincible behind armor plates that had turned aside every Allied weapon for 3 years. The Panzer IV had been your fortress, your shield, your ticket home. But on a summer morning in 1944, a single American soldier with a tube on his shoulder would shatter that illusion in ways no one could have predicted. The weapon they called a bazooka would do more than penetrate armor. It would pierce the very soul of German confidence and leave tank crews questioning everything they had been taught to believe. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the hedgerows of Normandy like ghostly fingers, wrapping around the steel behemoths that had rolled through the French countryside for weeks. Obergefreiter Klaus Richter pressed his eye to the periscope of his Panzer IV, scanning the terrain ahead with the practiced calm of a veteran. The tank's engine rumbled beneath him, a sound that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. Around him, his crew moved with the fluid precision of men who had fought together across half of Europe. "Movement ahead, 200 meters," whispered Franz, the radio operator, his voice barely audible over the mechanical symphony of gears and pistons. Klaus adjusted his view, squinting through the optical device at shadows that danced between the ancient stone walls that divided the Norman fields. Somewhere out there, American infantry waited with their Springfield rifles and Thompson submachine guns, weapons that posed no more threat to his tank than raindrops against a cathedral window. The Panzer IV Aus FH was a masterpiece of German engineering, its frontal armor 80 millimeters thick, sloped at angles calculated to deflect even the heaviest shells. Klaus had seen Sherman tanks explode like firecrackers when struck by his 75-millimeter gun, had watched Allied anti-tank rounds bounce harmlessly off his glasses plate like pebbles skipped across a pond. In 3 years of combat, from the steppes of Russia to the bocage of France, his tank had been scratched, dented, and scorched, but never truly threatened. The crew shared this confidence like a sacred belief. Gunter, the driver, had once joked that their Panzer could drive through hell itself and emerge with nothing but soot on the paint. Josef, the loader, kept a photograph of his sweetheart tucked behind a vision block, confident he would return to marry her because his steel castle would carry him safely home. Even young Heinrich, barely 18 and serving as the bow gunner, had abandoned his initial nervousness after witnessing firsthand how enemy weapons shattered against their armor like waves against a cliff. This confidence was not misplaced arrogance. It was built on experience, on countless engagements where their tank had emerged victorious while enemy positions were reduced to smoking craters. The Panzer IV had evolved through years of combat, each new variant incorporating lessons learned in blood and steel. The early models had been vulnerable to Soviet anti-tank guns, but the later versions, like Klaus's Aus FH, boasted armor thick enough to stop anything the Allies could throw at them. Klaus had read the intelligence reports with satisfaction. American anti-tank weapons were primitive by German standards. Their 37-millimeter guns were laughably inadequate, their bazookas little more than oversized fireworks. The intelligence officers had dismissed it as a weapon suitable only for bunkers and light vehicles, utterly incapable of threatening a properly armored tank. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the mist and revealing the patchwork of fields and hedgerows that stretched toward the village of St. Vit. Klaus's tank was part of a small column moving to reinforce German lines, positions that had been under pressure from American advances. The mission was routine, a show of force that would remind the enemy of the futility of challenging German armor. Through his periscope, Klaus could see the other tanks of his platoon spread across the landscape like iron predators. Lieutenant Weber's command tank led the formation, its long gun traversing slowly as the commanders searched for targets. Behind them, the supporting infantry moved in loose formation, their gray-green uniforms blending with the shadows of the hedgerows. The radio crackled with routine communications, position reports, fuel status, ammunition counts, the mundane details that kept a mechanized unit functioning. Klaus half-listened, his attention focused on the terrain ahead. The Bazooka country was perfect for ambushes, with its maze of ancient hedgerows and stone walls that could conceal enemy positions until the last moment. A childhood memory surfaced unbidden, his father showing him their old farmhouse in Bavaria, built of stones so thick that winter storms barely disturbed the warmth inside. "Good German craftsmanship," his father had said, running his hand along the ancient walls. "Built to last forever." That same pride in engineering excellence had created the Panzer IV, each rivet and weld a testament to German precision and ingenuity. Franz suddenly stiffened at his radio position, pressing the headphones tighter against his ears. "Multiple contacts reported ahead," he announced, his voice carrying a note of anticipation rather than concern. Contact with the enemy meant another opportunity to demonstrate German superiority, another chance to send the Americans running back to their landing beaches. Klaus felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that preceded combat, but it was tempered by the absolute certainty that his tank could handle whatever lay ahead. The Panzer IV had faced the best the Soviets could offer, their T-34s with their sloped armor and powerful guns, their fearsome Stalin tanks with armor plates that could stop a freight train. If German engineering could triumph in the furnace of the Eastern Front, what challenge could these Americans possibly present? The tank lurched slightly when Gunther navigated around a crater left by Allied bombing, the massive weight of the vehicle settling back onto its tracks with mechanical grace. Through the steel walls, Klaus could hear the distinctive sound of their engine, a growl that had become synonymous with German power throughout occupied Europe. It was a sound that sent enemy infantry scurrying for cover, that announced the arrival of the Wehrmacht's iron fist. Young Henrik shifted nervously at his position, checking and rechecking his MG-34 machine gun. Despite his youth, he had already proven himself in several engagements, his steady aim cutting down American infantrymen who were foolish enough to advance against their position. Klaus had taken the boy under his wing, teaching him the finer points of tank warfare, sharing the accumulated wisdom of campaigns fought from France to the gates of Moscow. "Remember, Heinrich," Klaus had told him during their first engagement together, "Americans fight differently than Russians. Russians charge like madmen, willing to die for every meter of ground. Americans are more cautious, more technical. They rely on their equipment rather than their courage. But equipment breaks, and when it does, they run." Joseph began arranging shells in the ready rack, the brass casings gleaming in the dim interior light. Each round represented devastating firepower, high-explosive shells that could level buildings, armor-piercing rounds that could punch through any Allied tank at ranges exceeding a kilometer. The mathematical precision of German ballistics had turned gunnery into a science, with range tables and firing solutions calculated to the finest detail. The radio crackled again, and Lieutenant Weber's voice filled the tank with calm authority. "Contact front. American infantry in defensive positions. We advance and eliminate resistance. Standard procedure." Klaus smiled grimly. Standard procedure meant unleashing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The full fury of German armor against positions that could not hope to resist. The Americans would learn, as so many others had learned, that challenging the Wehrmacht's armored spearhead was an exercise in futility. Through his periscope, Klaus could make out the distinctive shapes of American helmets among the hedgerows, the dull green of their uniforms barely visible against the vegetation. They had chosen their positions well, using the natural terrain to provide cover and concealment. But concealment from small arms fire was meaningless against the massive guns of German tanks. The column began to deploy into attack formation, each tank taking a position that would maximize their fields of fire, while minimizing their exposure to any potential threats. Not that exposure was a significant concern. American anti-tank weapons were so inadequate that German tanks could advance with virtual impunity. Klaus had seen intelligence photographs of destroyed Shermans, their thin armor peeled back like tin cans, victims of German 75-millimeter guns that could penetrate their hulls from ranges that put the Americans far beyond effective retaliation. Franz reported intermittent radio chatter from the American positions, fragments of English that their translators had decoded as typical pre-combat communications, supply requests, position updates, the routine business of soldiers preparing for battle. There was no indication that the Americans possessed anything more dangerous than their standard infantry weapons and perhaps a few antiquated anti-tank guns that had proven useless against modern German armor. The morning sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the Norman landscape and illuminating the ancient stone walls that had divided these fields for centuries. Klaus wondered briefly about the farmers who had built these walls, generation after generation, adding stones to boundaries that seemed as permanent as the earth itself. Soon those same walls would provide cover for American troops who had no understanding that their sanctuary was about to become their tomb. Gunther's voice came over the intercom, calm and professional. Engine temperature normal, fuel at 70%, ready for extended operations. The Panzer IV's mechanical reliability was legendary among German tank crews. Unlike the temperamental Panthers with their transmission problems or the massive Tigers that broke down with alarming frequency, the Panzer IV was a workhorse that could fight all day and return for more tomorrow. Klaus adjusted his commander's cupola, feeling the smooth rotation of precision bearings that allowed him to scan the entire horizon without exposing himself to enemy fire. Through the thick glass of his vision blocks, he could see the world with perfect clarity while remaining completely protected from anything the Americans might throw at him. It was the perfect fusion of visibility and invulnerability, another testament to German engineering excellence. The memory of his first tank surfaced unexpectedly, a Panzer III that had carried him through the early campaigns in Poland and France. Even that lighter tank had seemed invincible at the time, brushing aside Polish anti-tank guns and French 25mm weapons like a man pushing through cobwebs. But the Panzer IV represented evolution, improvement, the constant refinement that kept German armor ahead of anything their enemies could field. Heinrich's voice crackled over the intercom, tight with anticipation. Visual contact with American positions, infantry in prepared positions, approximately 300 meters. Klaus swiveled his periscope to confirm the sighting, noting the careful placement of American foxholes and the camouflage nets that attempted to conceal their positions. Professional work, but ultimately futile against tanks that could engage them from beyond the effective range of their weapons. The tactical situation was textbook perfect. German armor advancing against fixed infantry positions with no meaningful anti-tank support. Klaus had studied similar scenarios at the tank school in Putlos,
had read after-action reports from dozens of such engagements. The outcome was always the same. German tanks would close to effective range, systematically destroy enemy positions with high explosive shells, and infantry would mop up any survivors foolish enough to continue resistance. Joseph reported ammunition status with mechanical precision. 42 rounds high explosive, 18 armor piercing, 12 smoke, ready for sustained fire. More than enough firepower to level every American position within sight. Klaus had once seen a single Panzer IV destroy an entire company of Soviet infantry in 15 minutes, methodically working from foxhole to foxhole until nothing moved in the target area. The radio brought word from other elements of their formation. Motorcycle scouts reporting clear roads to the rear, artillery observers confirming target coordinates, supply vehicles maintaining their positions in the assembly area. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned, with German efficiency and organization evident at every level. This was how the Wehrmacht conducted operations, with clockwork precision that left nothing to chance. Franz suddenly straightened at his radio position, his expression shifting from routine alertness to sharp attention.
Had advanced to within 200 meters of his position. At this range, high-explosive shells would be devastatingly effective, turning their position into a crater and eliminating any threat they might pose. His finger moved to the firing switch, ready to demonstrate the futility of challenging German steel. But something in the Americans' movements gave him pause. They weren't taking cover, weren't digging in for a defensive engagement. Instead, they were moving with the purposeful advance of soldiers who possessed weapons capable of engaging tanks at close range. Klaus had seen similar movements from Soviet anti-tank teams armed with captured Panzer IV rockets, but intelligence insisted the Americans possessed no such weapons. The morning sun continued its climb, casting the Norman landscape in sharp relief and illuminating every detail of the developing battle. Ancient stone walls that had witnessed centuries of human struggle now provided cover for a new kind of warfare, one where technology and tactics evolved with deadly speed. Klaus pressed his eye closer to the periscope, trying to identify exactly what weapons the advancing Americans carried. Franz's voice carried a note of urgency that was unusual for the veteran radio operator. Multiple American units reporting bazooka ready on intercepted frequencies. Weapon appears to be deployed in teams of 2 men. Klaus filed the information away, but remained skeptical. Every army gave intimidating names to their weapons. It was a form of psychological warfare as old as combat itself. The range continued to close as both sides maneuvered for advantage. Klaus could see American soldiers moving with the practiced efficiency of men who had trained extensively for this moment, their movements coordinated and purposeful rather than the random scrambling of panicked infantry. Whatever these bazookas might be, the Americans clearly had confidence in their effectiveness. Gunther reported from his driver's position, his voice carrying the mechanical calm that characterized German tank crews. Terrain ahead, suitable for continued advance, no obstacles or hazards detected. The Panzer IV's broad tracks and powerful engine could handle the bocage country with ease, crushing hedgerows and stone walls that would stop lighter vehicles. The radio crackled with reports from other tanks in the formation, confirming successful engagement of American positions and continued advance toward their objectives. But Klaus noticed that none of the reports mentioned the enemy retreating, unusual for infantry facing armor. Most foot soldiers broke and ran when confronted by tanks, seeking escape routes that would take them away from weapons they could not hope to defeat. Joseph chambered a high-explosive round with practiced efficiency, the heavy shells sliding into the breach with the mechanical precision that characterized all aspects of German gunnery. Ready to fire, Obergefreiter. Target identified and ranged. Klaus could see the American position clearly through his sight, soldiers moving with purpose among positions that offered concealment but no real protection from tank guns. The moment stretched taut with anticipation, predator and prey caught in the ancient dance of combat that had played out on battlefields from antiquity to the present day. Klaus felt the weight of his tank's advantages, armor, firepower, mobility, protection, all combining to create an almost insurmountable tactical superiority. The Americans, brave as they might be, were bringing rifles to a tank fight. Through his periscope, Klaus could see individual American faces now, young men far from home who had volunteered to fight fascism in a foreign land. For a moment, he felt a flicker of respect for their courage, even as he prepared to demonstrate its futility. War was ultimately about superior technology and tactics, not bravery, and German superiority in both areas was undeniable. The radio brought word that supporting infantry had identified American anti-tank guns in concealed positions, but the reports were dismissive. Obsolete, 37mm weapons, no threat to modern armor, came the assessment from a veteran Feldwebel who had faced similar guns in earlier campaigns. Klaus nodded grimly. American industrial might was impressive, but their weapons technology lagged years behind German innovation. Heinrich suddenly tensed at his position, his voice carrying a note of confusion. "Sir, Americans with strange weapons, tube-like devices, two-man teams, approximately 150 meters." Klaus swiveled his periscope to confirm the sighting, noting soldiers who carried unfamiliar equipment that looked more like engineering tools than weapons. The devices were indeed tube-like, carried by pairs of soldiers who moved with the practiced coordination of specialized teams. One man carried the launcher itself, while his partner hauled what appeared to be ammunition in a canvas bag. They were advancing to positions that would bring them within uncomfortably close range of the German tanks, showing either remarkable courage or dangerous ignorance of the tactical situation. Klaus had studied American weapons extensively during his training, memorizing the silhouettes and capabilities of everything from pistols to howitzers. But these tube-like devices were unfamiliar, not matching anything in German intelligence files. They appeared crude, almost improvised, lacking the precision engineering that characterized proper anti-tank weapons. The tactical doctrine was clear: eliminate unknown threats before they could develop into actual dangers. Klaus brought his main gun to bear on the nearest American team, preparing to demonstrate why infantry should never approach within range of tank weapons. The high-explosive shell would end their advance permanently, sending a message to other Americans about the futility of challenging German armor. Franz suddenly stiffened at his radio position, his expression shifting from routine monitoring to sharp alarm. "Sir, intercepted message. Bazooka teams, targets acquired, range confirmed. Multiple American units reporting ready to engage." The urgency in his voice was unmistakable. Whatever these bazookas might be, the Americans clearly considered them capable of engaging tanks. Klaus felt the first stirring of unease, a professional instinct honed by years of combat that warned when situations were developing beyond expected parameters. The Americans were behaving like soldiers who possessed effective anti-tank weapons, advancing to close range with confidence rather than desperation. But intelligence insisted no such weapons existed in American inventories. Through his commander's cupola, Klaus could see the tube-carrying teams reaching their firing positions, the devices being prepared with practiced efficiency that suggested extensive training. One soldier aimed the tube while his partner handled what appeared to be ammunition in a canvas bag. Their movements coordinated with the precision of men who had rehearsed this procedure countless times. The morning air carried sounds of battle from other sectors: the crack of tank guns, the chatter of machine guns, the dull thump of explosions. But here, in this particular field, bordered by ancient stone walls, an unusual quiet had settled over both sides, as German tanks and American infantry faced each other across a distance measured in meters rather than kilometers. Klaus made his decision with the decisive authority that had kept him alive through 3 years of combat. Unknown weapons required immediate elimination before their capabilities could be tested. His finger moved to the firing switch, ready to send a 75mm high-explosive shell into the American position and end whatever threat these mysterious bazookas might represent. But as his finger tightened on the switch, Klaus noticed something that made him pause. The American soldier aiming the tube-like device was looking directly at his tank, the weapon pointed with the steady precision of a man who believed he could damage 50 tons of armored steel. The confidence in that soldier's posture was unmistakable. This was not a desperate last stand, but a calculated engagement between opponents who each believed they possessed the superior weapon. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, Two technologies about to test themselves against each other in the crucible of combat. German engineering, refined through years of warfare and built on the foundation of superior metallurgy and precision manufacturing, faced American innovation, born of industrial might and practical ingenuity. In seconds, one side's confidence would be shattered forever, and the other would learn a lesson that would echo through the remainder of the war. Klaus pressed his eye closer to the periscope, studying the American position with the intensity of a man whose life depended on accurate assessment. 50 meters away, across ground scarred by tank tracks and littered with the debris of battle, an enemy soldier prepared to test his weapon against armor that had never been penetrated by anything smaller than a dedicated anti-tank gun. The radio crackled with routine traffic, but Klaus barely heard it. His world had narrowed to this single engagement, this moment when theory would meet reality, and one side would discover that their confidence had been built on foundations of sand rather than stone. Through the thick steel of his tank's armor, he could hear his own heartbeat, steady and strong, the pulse of a man who had faced death before and emerged victorious. The American soldier's movements were deliberate, professional, showing none of the haste that characterized desperate men using inadequate weapons. He adjusted his aim with the care of a marksman, his partner ready with additional ammunition that suggested they expected to fire more than once. Everything about their behavior contradicted intelligence assessments that dismissed American anti-tank capabilities. Franz suddenly straightened, his hand pressed to his headphones as he strained to catch a transmission that seemed to be coming from very close range. "American radio traffic, sir. They're talking about armor thickness, penetration values, technical information that suggests—" His voice trailed off as the implications became clear. Klaus felt cold certainty settle in his stomach like a stone dropped into still water. The Americans weren't advancing with crude weapons and desperate courage. They were advancing with technical knowledge and professional confidence. Someone had taught them about German armor, had given them weapons designed specifically to defeat it, and now those weapons were being aimed at his tank from point-blank range. The moment stretched toward its inevitable conclusion. Physical laws and metallurgical properties about to be tested in the most direct way possible. In the American foxhole, a soldier prepared to fire a rocket that would either bounce harmlessly off German steel or penetrate armor that had never been penetrated by anything smaller than a dedicated anti-tank gun. In the German tank, 5 men waited behind protection they had trusted with their lives, about to discover whether their faith had been misplaced. Klaus's finger hovered over the firing switch, the weight of decision heavy on his shoulders. Fire now and eliminate the threat before it could act? Wait and risk discovering what these mysterious bazookas could actually accomplish. The choice would determine not only the outcome of this engagement, but potentially the fate of every man in his crew. Through his periscope, he could see the American soldier making final adjustments to his aim, the tube-like weapon steady and purposeful in his hands. Whatever happened in the next few seconds would write a new chapter in the history of tank warfare, a lesson that would echo through armored units on both sides of the conflict. The ancient Norman stone walls stood witness to another moment of human conflict, their limestone blocks worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. They had seen Romans march past, had watched Vikings raid, had witnessed medieval knights charge with lance and sword. Now they provided cover for a new kind of warfare, where industrial technology and human courage met in combinations that would have been incomprehensible to earlier generations. Klaus took a deep breath, tasting the metallic air of his tank's interior, hearing the mechanical symphony of engine and transmission that had become the soundtrack of his war. In moments, that familiar world would either remain intact or be shattered by the impact of American innovation on German certainty. The test was about to begin, and neither side would ever be the same again. The flash came first, brilliant white against the morning sky, followed instantly by a sound unlike anything Klaus had ever heard in 3 years of tank warfare. Not the sharp crack of an anti-tank gun or the whistle of incoming artillery, but a peculiar whoosh that seemed to tear through the air itself. Before his mind could process what was happening, the world exploded into chaos. The impact struck the Panzer IV's frontal armor with the force of a sledgehammer wielded by a giant. The tank lurched backward on its tracks, steel screaming against steel, as the hull absorbed energies that should have been impossible from a shoulder-fired weapon. Through the sudden ringing in his ears, Klaus heard Josef cry out in shock, his voice high and tight with disbelief. But the armor held. 80 millimeters of hardened steel, sloped at precisely calculated angles, had done its job. Klaus felt a surge of vindication, his faith in German engineering confirmed once again. The mysterious American weapon had struck with impressive force, but German metallurgy had proven superior. Whatever these bazookas might be, they were still no match for proper armor protection. "Damage report," Klaus barked into his throat microphone, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. One by one, his crew responded with mechanical precision. Gunther reported engine and transmission functioning normally. Franz confirmed all radio equipment operational. Heinrich's machine gun remained ready for action. Josef declared the main gun and ammunition undamaged. Klaus pressed his eye to the periscope, scanning the American positions for signs of the weapon that had struck them. Smoke drifted from the hedgerow where the bazooka team had fired, but he could see soldiers already moving, preparing for another shot. The confidence in their movements was unmistakable. They believed they could damage his tank, despite the clear evidence that their first attempt had failed. Through the radio came reports from other tanks in the formation, similar accounts of mysterious impacts that had shaken crews but caused no real damage. Lieutenant Weber's voice crackled with professional irritation as he described American soldiers with tube-like weapons engaging at close range. "Psychological warfare," he concluded dismissively. "Loud noises designed to rattle inexperienced crews." Klaus nodded grimly, though doubt nagged at the edges of his consciousness. The impact had felt different from anything he had experienced, more focused and intense than conventional weapons. But the armor had held, just as German engineers had promised it would. Whatever innovations the Americans thought they had developed, they were still years behind German technology. Used. "They're discussing penetration angles, armor thickness, optimal firing ranges," he reported, his voice carrying uncertainty. "This doesn't sound like psychological warfare, Obergefreiter. They're talking like men who expect to punch through steel." A second flash erupted from the hedgerows, followed by that distinctive whoosh that seemed to slice through the morning air. Klaus braced himself for another jarring impact, confident that his armor would again prove its superiority. But this time, the American soldier had aimed differently, targeting the turret ring where the main gun met the hull. The explosion that followed redefined Klaus's understanding of what was possible in tank warfare. The shaped charge warhead of the American M1A1 rocket struck the junction between turret and hull with surgical precision, its copper liner focusing explosive energy into a jet of superheated metal that cut through German steel as if it were butter. The penetration was instantaneous and catastrophic. Molten copper sprayed into the fighting compartment like liquid fire, igniting ammunition and hydraulic fluid in a chain reaction that turned the tank's interior into a furnace. Klaus felt searing heat wash over him as the shaped charge effect did what 3 years of enemy fire had failed to accomplish. It found a way through armor that had seemed invulnerable. Josef screamed as molten metal splashed across his position, his uniform catching fire as temperatures soared beyond anything human flesh could endure. The ammunition rack exploded in sympathetic detonation, 75mm shells cooking off in rapid succession and turning the tank into a blast furnace. Gunther frantically tried to reverse, but the controls had been severed by the penetrating jet of superheated copper. Klaus found himself staring in absolute disbelief at a hole punched clean through steel that had never been breached. The opening was small, perhaps the diameter of a man's thumb, but it had admitted forces that were systematically destroying his tank from within. Through that impossible aperture, American innovation had reached past German engineering and touched the vulnerable humanity inside. Heinrich was already moving, abandoning his machine gun position as flames spread through the fighting compartment. Franz tore off his headphones, his hands moving with desperate efficiency as he prepared to evacuate a tank that had suddenly transformed from fortress to tomb. The radio crackled with similar reports from across the formation. Panzer IVs burning, crews abandoning vehicles that had protected them faithfully until this moment. The escape hatch opened with metallic protest, and Klaus hauled himself through the aperture into morning air that tasted impossibly sweet after the choking smoke of his burning tank. Behind him, Yosef's screams had stopped, replaced by the hungry roar of flames consuming everything that had once seemed permanent and reliable. He rolled away from the Panzer IV just as the fuel tanks ignited, sending a pillar of black smoke climbing toward the Norman sky. 50 tons of German engineering, 3 years of combat experience, and absolute faith in technological superiority had been reduced to scrap metal in less than 30 seconds. The impossible had become inevitable, and Klaus found himself lying in French dirt, staring at the burning wreckage of everything he had believed. Heinrich crawled up beside him, his young face blackened with smoke and streaked with tears that had nothing to do with the acrid air. "How?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackling flames. "How did they do that? Intelligence said their weapons couldn't penetrate our armor." Klaus had no answer. The evidence burned before them with undeniable finality, but his mind refused to accept what his eyes had witnessed. American soldiers with crude-looking weapons had accomplished what the best Soviet anti-tank guns had failed to achieve. They had turned German armor into funeral pyres using technology that looked like it belonged in an engineering workshop rather than on a battlefield. Who had suffered burns to his hands and face during the frantic evacuation. The driver's eyes held the same stunned disbelief that Klaus felt crushing his chest like a physical weight. "The transmission was fine," Gunther mumbled, his voice carrying the mechanical precision that had characterized his reporting even in the moment of disaster. "Engine temperature normal, fuel at 70%, everything was functioning perfectly." The other tanks in the formation were suffering similar fates, their crews abandoning vehicles that had seemed invulnerable just minutes before. Lieutenant Weber's command tank burned fiercely, its ammunition continuing to cook off in spectacular explosions that sent debris raining across the Norman countryside. 3 years of combat experience, thousands of hours of training, and absolute faith in German superiority had been rendered meaningless in the space of a single engagement. American soldiers emerged from their concealed positions, moving with the professional confidence of men who had accomplished exactly what they had set out to do. They carried their bazooka launchers casually, almost carelessly, as if the destruction of German armor was routine rather than revolutionary. Some paused to examine the burning tanks, taking photographs and making notes with the methodical thoroughness of technicians documenting a successful experiment. Klaus watched an American sergeant approach the wreckage of his Panzer IV, studying the entry hole with professional interest. The man's expression was neither cruel nor triumphant, simply satisfied, like a craftsman examining work well done. He made notes on a small pad, measured the penetration with calipers, and photographed the damage from multiple angles. The sergeant noticed Klaus watching and walked over, his rifle held ready, but not threatening. Up close, the American looked young, perhaps the same age as Heinrich, but his eyes held the steady confidence of a man who had mastered his trade. He spoke in accented German, his words careful but clear. "Panzerschreck," he said, gesturing toward the bazooka launcher carried by one of his men. "German rocket launcher, captured in Tunisia. We improved the design, made it simpler, more reliable. Your engineers taught us well." The irony in his voice was unmistakable. American weapons had been developed using lessons learned from captured German technology. Klaus felt the world shift beneath him, understanding flooding through his consciousness like ice water through his veins. The Americans hadn't developed their bazooka in isolation. They had captured German Panzer IV rockets, studied them, improved them, and turned German innovation against its creators. The shape-charged technology that had just destroyed his tank was fundamentally German, refined by American industrial might and deployed with American tactical efficiency. The sergeant continued his casual explanation, apparently unaware of the psychological devastation his words were inflicting. M1A1 rocket launcher, we call it bazooka. Shape-charge warhead, effective against armor up to 4 inches thick. Your Panzer IV has good sloped armor, but the turret ring is vulnerable. Weak point in the design. Weak point in the design. The words echoed in Klaus's mind with the finality of a death sentence. German engineers, for all their precision and technical excellence, had created a flaw that American observation had identified and exploited. Franz stared at the American sergeant with expressions of men watching their fundamental beliefs crumble into dust. But intelligence reports said your weapons were ineffective against tank armor, he managed, his voice hollow with disbelief. The sergeant smiled, an expression that combined professional pride with genuine amusement. Intelligence reports can be wrong. We've been testing these weapons for months, training crews, identifying weak points in German armor. Your tanks are good, but no armor is perfect. Find the weak
spot, hit it with enough force, and even the best protection fails. Heinrich stepped forward, his young face twisted with confusion and anger. But we destroyed your Shermans easily. Our guns penetrated your armor at ranges where you couldn't even target us. How can your infantry weapons be superior to our tank guns? The American's expression grew more serious, his voice taking on the tone of a teacher addressing a promising but misguided student. Different tools for different jobs. Your 75mm gun is excellent for long-range engagement, but it requires a tank to carry it, fuel to power it, trained crew to operate it. Our bazooka weighs 35 pounds, can be carried by 2 men, and fires a rocket that doesn't care about range tables or ballistic coefficients. It just has to hit the target. Klaus listened to the exchange with growing horror, not because of what the American was saying, but because it made perfect sense. German doctrine emphasized technological superiority, complex engineering solutions, and overwhelming firepower delivered from protected positions. American doctrine emphasized simplicity, mass production, and weapons that could be operated by ordinary infantry units with minimal training. The philosophical implications were staggering. Germany had invested enormous resources in developing the world's most advanced tanks, crewed by highly trained specialists and supported by complex logistical systems. America had developed simple weapons that could be manufactured by the thousands and distributed to ordinary infantry units, turning every soldier into a potential tank killer. More American soldiers approached, some carrying additional bazooka rounds, others dragging captured German equipment toward collection points. Their movements were efficient, professional, displaying none of the chaotic looting that might have been expected after such a decisive victory. They treated the destruction of German armor as routine business rather than momentous achievement. Klaus noticed that several Americans wore glasses, their uniforms bearing patches indicating technical specializations rather than traditional combat roles. These weren't frontline infantry troops. They were technicians, engineers, specialists who had been trained specifically to counter German armor using weapons designed for that purpose. The engagement had been planned, rehearsed, and executed with scientific precision. One of the technical specialists approached the smoking wreckage of Klaus's tank, measuring blast patterns and photographing the internal damage through the entry hole. He spoke to colleagues in rapid English, using terminology that sounded more appropriate to a laboratory than a battlefield. Klaus caught fragments of the conversation: shaped charge efficiency, standoff distance, armor penetration coefficients. The realization struck him with the force of another bazooka round. This hadn't been a combat engagement, it had been a field test. American forces had used his tank and crew as experimental subjects, testing weapons and tactics against live targets to validate theoretical calculations. The professional dispassion in their approach wasn't cruelty, it was scientific methodology applied to the business of killing. Franz overheard the same conversations, his expression shifting from disbelief to something approaching awe. They're not soldiers. They're scientists, engineers. They've turned tank killing into a technical problem and solved it with mathematics and metallurgy. The American sergeant finished his documentation and prepared to move on, but Klaus found himself compelled to ask the question that had been burning in his mind since the first penetration. Why didn't intelligence know about your weapons? How did you keep them secret? The sergeant paused, considering his answer with the care of a man who understood the strategic implications of information warfare. No secret. We've been using bazookas in Italy for months, captured some of your Panzer IV rockets in Tunisia last year. Your intelligence officers probably saw the reports,
but they didn't want to believe them. Easier to assume American weapons were inferior than to admit they might be effective. The truth hit Klaus like a physical blow, doubling him over with its implications. German intelligence hadn't failed to detect American capabilities. They had dismissed evidence that contradicted their preconceptions. Reports of effective American anti-tank weapons had been filtered through assumptions about German technological superiority, emerging as reassuring assessments of enemy inadequacy. Heinrich stared at the burning tanks with tears streaming down his blackened face, his voice cracking with the strain of accepting realities that shattered his worldview. We believed we were invincible. The Panzer IV had never been penetrated by infantry weapons. How could we have been so wrong? Klaus had no answer, because the question struck at the heart of everything he had been taught to believe about German superiority and enemy weakness. The evidence burned before them with undeniable clarity, but accepting that evidence meant abandoning fundamental assumptions about technological advancement, military effectiveness, and the inevitable triumph of superior engineering. The American technical specialist finished his examination and approached Klaus with the courtesy of a professional addressing another professional. "Your tank was well designed," he said in careful German. "Good armor, excellent gun, reliable mechanical systems. But warfare evolves. Static defenses become obsolete when someone develops better weapons. Your engineers will learn from this engagement and design better armor. Then we'll develop better penetrators. That's how progress works." Progress. The word carried implications that Klaus found almost unbearable. American innovation wasn't accidental or temporary. It was systematic, methodical, designed to stay ahead of German countermeasures. While German engineers had been perfecting existing designs, American scientists had been developing revolutionary new approaches to defeating armor protection. Franz pointed toward the horizon, where smoke columns marked the locations of other German armored vehicles. "How many tanks have you destroyed with these weapons?" he asked, his voice carrying professional curiosity mixed with personal dread. The specialist consulted notes in a waterproof folder, his demeanor remaining clinically detached as he provided statistics that represented the destruction of Klaus's entire world. This sector, approximately 40 Panzer IVs and 6 Panthers in the past week. Division-wide, approximately 300 German armored vehicles destroyed or disabled by bazooka teams since the Normandy landings. 300. The number struck Klaus with the force of revelation, its implications spreading through his consciousness like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. This wasn't an isolated engagement or a lucky shot. It was systematic destruction conducted on industrial scale. American forces had developed not just effective weapons, but effective tactics for employing them against German armor.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.